There is a category of weapon that military engineers rarely put their names on. No serial number on the designer's record. No official procurement order in the open archive. These devices were built, distributed, and used on an industrial scale across every major theater of World War II, and when the war ended, the paperwork describing them was either reclassified or destroyed. What you are about to hear is not speculation. These are confirmed devices documented in after-action reports, war crimes tribunal testimony, and field manuals captured from both sides. 12 of them. Each one banned. Each one carried into battle anyway. Now, before we go any further, the reason these devices share a category isn't just lethality. Almost everything on a battlefield is lethal. What put these specific traps in a class of their own, what made military lawyers in 1945 reach for words like perfidy and treachery in official documents, was the target, not soldiers in a firefight, not fortified positions. The target was the person kneeling down to help. The medic. The combat engineer clearing a path. The infantryman checking on a fallen comrade. The civilian who picked up something that looked familiar. These traps were engineered to punish the human instinct to assist. That is what got them banned. That is also why both sides kept using them until the last shot was fired. Let's start at the beginning. Number 1. The S-mine. The Germans called it the shrapnel mine 35, but every Allied soldier from North Africa to the Siegfried Line knew it by one name, the Bouncing Betty. The device itself was a steel cylinder, roughly the diameter of a coffee can, buried just below the surface with 3 small prongs sticking above the soil. Step on those prongs, apply approximately 15 pounds of pressure, release that pressure. As you lift your foot, and a propellant charge fires the main body of the mine upward to a height of approximately 2 to 4 feet before the fragmentation charge detonates. The shrapnel pattern was designed to distribute 360 steel balls and fragments at roughly waist-to-chest height, not to kill outright, to wound, severely, multiple casualties per detonation, because a screaming wounded man draws in the people around him, and those people step on the next mine. The German army had deployed an estimated 1.9 million S-mines by 1943. Allied engineers attempting to clear minefields in Tunisia described finding tripwire attachments added to some units, meaning the mine would fire if you attempted to lift or defuse it rather than step on it. That modification wasn't in the original specifications. Someone in the field added it. The Hague Convention of 1907, Article 23, explicitly prohibited weapons calculated to cause unnecessary suffering. The S-mine's deliberate wounding over killing design existed in a gray zone that military lawyers argued over for years after the war. No prosecution was ever filed specifically for its use. Number 2. The German shoe mine 42. This one is less famous, which is exactly why it belongs on this list. The shoe mine, shortened in most Allied field reports to shoe mine, was a wooden box approximately the size of a paperback novel containing a small block of explosive and a simple pressure fuse. It held less than 200 grams of TNT equivalent. That amount was calculated, very deliberately, not to kill. It was calibrated to remove a foot. Combat surgeons treating shoe mine casualties in France and Italy in 1944 described injuries with near-identical patterns. The foot gone at the ankle, the lower leg intact but shattered, survivable with immediate treatment. The device was specifically engineered to create a long-term casualty, a man who would require evacuation, surgery, hospital time, and the attention of multiple other soldiers and medics. One mine, one detonation, potentially removing 4 to 6 personnel from combat effectiveness. Its wooden construction made it nearly invisible to early Allied metal detectors. Sappers had to probe for it by hand, with bayonets and rods, inches at a time. The Wehrmacht produced approximately 1 million shoe mines during the war. After the fall of Germany, Allied disposal teams found stockpiles in 11 countries. In Belgium, a farmer in the Ardennes region struck a shoe mine with a plow in 1961, 15 years after the war. Number 3. The Model 24 booby trap conversion. Now, this is where German field engineering crossed a very specific legal line. The Model 24 stick grenade, the potato masher, was a standard-issue weapon. Soldiers carried them. Nobody banned the grenade. What got banned, what appears in multiple war crimes investigation files from the Judge Advocate General's Corps in 1945, was a specific field modification. German troops, particularly in the retreat phases of the Eastern Front and later in France and Italy, would place an armed Model 24 grenade beneath the body of a fallen soldier. The pull cord or pin was attached to the body in a concealed manner. When Allied soldiers or medics approached to check the body, render first aid, or retrieve identification, the grenade detonated. The Hague Regulations, Article 23, subsection F, specifically prohibits the improper use of a flag of truce or of the enemy's national insignia and uniform. The Geneva Convention went further in protecting medical personnel. Using a human body as a delivery mechanism for an anti-personnel weapon specifically positioned to trigger when aid was rendered was documented in testimony at Nuremberg as a violation of the laws of land warfare. German field commanders were aware of this. Documentation captured from Army Group Center in 1944 includes an order acknowledging the practice and not prohibiting it, regulating it, specifying when it was appropriate. Would you carry a weapon that your own command acknowledges is a war crime but issues guidelines for anyway? Military historians still argue whether that order was an attempt to limit the practice or formalize it. Drop that in the comments, because that distinction mattered at the tribunal. Number 4. The Glasman glass mine replaced virtually all metal components with glass and pressed cardboard. The only metal in the device was a small glass ampule containing acid, which served as the fuse mechanism. Total metallic content, effectively 0. It was buried at approximately 2 inches depth and required only about 15 pounds of pressure to detonate. The charge was roughly 200 grams of explosive, same as the shoe mine, same wound profile. The design innovation here was purely about defeating the countermeasure, specifically the American SCR 625 mine detector and the British No. 4 detector, both of which relied on electromagnetic induction to locate buried metal. Against a Glasman, those devices were silent, completely silent. Combat engineers in Italy's Winterline described clearing areas that had already been swept by detectors, probing manually, and finding fields densely seeded with glass mines the detectors had not registered once. The Glasman 43 was produced in quantities exceeding 500,000 units before the end of the war. Post-war disposal teams called them the invisible ones. Because glass does not corrode the way steel does, intact glass mines were still being found in Italian farmland in the 1980s. Number 5. The S-decoy or dummy mine with secondary device. This one is not in most popular histories. It comes from technical intelligence reports compiled by the U.S. Army's Ordnance Corps in 1944 and 1945. German engineers, aware that Allied sappers had developed standard procedures for marking and bypassing detected mines, began placing inert dummy devices, non-functional mine casings, in obvious positions that Allied engineers would locate easily. The dummy would be marked with a white tape flag indicating mine detected, do not cross. Beneath the dummy, at a depth of 8 to 12 inches, was a second device, a real anti-personnel mine or an improvised charge connected to the dummy's casing via a wire. When a sapper attempted to extract the dummy for examination, or when the white tape flag was disturbed by subsequent troop movement, the secondary detonated. The design assumed Allied training would work against Allied soldiers. The more thoroughly trained the engineer, the more likely he was to approach, examine, and attempt to clear what looked like a detected but unexploded mine. At least 14 documented cases of this device type were recorded in the European theater between June and November of 1944. The casualty profile was specific. The men it killed were consistently the most experienced engineers in their units, the ones qualified to lead mine clearing operations. Those losses had cascading effects on unit capability that went well beyond the individual casualties. Number 6. The booby-trapped rations and personal effects. Now, this category expands the violation in a different direction, away from the battlefield and into the hands of civilians and prisoners. After-action reports from the Italian campaign and from the liberation of France document a recurring pattern. German forces in retreat would leave behind caches of food, water containers, cigarettes, and personal items, watches, wallets, pens in buildings, vehicles, and along roadsides. A portion of these items were connected to concealed explosive charges. The fuse mechanisms varied. Some were pressure-release devices hidden beneath the object, triggered when it was lifted. Others used a simple chemical delay fuse, meaning the device would detonate several minutes after the item was moved, potentially after it had been passed between multiple hands. The Geneva Convention's protections for civilian populations and the Hague Regulations' general prohibition on treacherous killing both applied here. What makes this category particularly significant legally is that these devices killed not only soldiers but documented civilian casualties in France, Belgium, and Italy. Between 1943 and 1945, a 9-year-old child in a village outside Caen in the summer of 1944 picked up a fountain pen left in a schoolroom. The after-action report is in the records of the Judge Advocate General. The case was flagged for prosecution. It was never prosecuted. Look, the reason it wasn't prosecuted wasn't lack of evidence. It was a calculation. Because Allied forces were using similar devices, not identical. But similar enough that opening that door at a tribunal had consequences nobody was willing to accept in 1945. Number 7. The American Composition C2 improvised anti-disturbance device. This is where the Allied side of this history begins, and it is documented in U.S. Army field manuals and Office of Strategic Services training documents that were partially declassified in the 1980s. American combat engineers and OSS operatives in France, Italy, and the Pacific Theater were trained in the construction of improvised booby traps using standard demolition materials. Primarily, Composition C2, the predecessor to C4 plastic explosive, combined with standard M1 pull fuses, M5 pressure release fuses, and M1 delay fuses. The training materials explicitly covered anti-lift devices, anti-disturbance configurations, and what the manuals described as nuisance, mining the placement of small charges in areas of expected enemy activity, specifically to disrupt movement, demoralize, and force the enemy to slow down and probe carefully rather than advance with speed. The OSS training documents go further. Section 14 of the OSS Field Demolitions Guide, captured and re-examined by historians at the National Archives in the 1990s, contains instructions for what is listed as dead man's traps, the placement of explosive charges beneath or around the bodies of enemy casualties in areas where enemy recovery teams were expected to operate. The language in the document is clinical. The intent is identical to what German forces were doing on the Eastern Front. The Allied manual was dated 1943. Number 8. The British Time Pencil and the Special Operations Executive's Booby Trap Briefcase. Britain's Special Operations Executive, the SOE, was established in 1941 specifically to conduct sabotage and subversion behind enemy lines. Their devices are among the most technically sophisticated improvised weapons produced by any side during World War II. The time pencil, officially the Switch No. 10, was a brass tube containing a glass ampule of cupric chloride acid. When the tube was squeezed, the ampule broke, and the acid began eating through a thin steel wire. When the wire dissolved, a spring-loaded striker fired a detonator. The delay time depended on the temperature of the environment. In cold conditions, the acid worked slower, extending the delay. In warm conditions, it worked faster. Agents were trained to adjust for ambient temperature before setting a device. The time pencil was designed to give an agent time to be miles away before detonation. It was used to destroy locomotives, factory equipment, fuel depots, and communications infrastructure throughout occupied Europe. The same fuse mechanism was adapted into what SOE records describe as anti-handling devices, explosives concealed inside ordinary objects, a briefcase, a piece of coal, a book, a wine bottle designed to detonate when opened, handled or moved by German security personnel or informers who might search an agent's belongings. The coal bomb deserves specific attention. SOE produced explosive charges molded and painted to be visually indistinguishable from ordinary lumps of coal. These were introduced into coal supplies destined for German industrial facilities or ships. A stoker shovel-loading coal into a furnace would unknowingly drop the charge into a high-temperature combustion chamber. The resulting explosion in an enclosed furnace was catastrophic. Documented use in occupied France. Documented use in Norway. At least one confirmed sinking of a river barge on the Rhine in 1943 attributed to a coal bomb introduced into the vessel's fuel supply. The stoker was a conscripted French civilian worker. He did not survive. He is not listed among the victims in any war crimes investigation because he was working for the Germans. That is the logic of that war, documented in writing, and it sits in the SOE archive in Q. Number 9. The Soviet DP mine and the NKVD's anti-disturbance devices in Kiev. In September of 1941, German forces entered Kiev following one of the largest encirclements in military history. Within days of the occupation, a series of massive explosions tore through the city center. The Khreshchatyk Kiev's main boulevard was destroyed over the course of several days as buildings rigged with delayed explosive charges detonated in sequence. The NKVD and Red Army engineers had spent weeks wiring the city before the German advance reached it. This much is well documented and legally permissible under the laws of war. Destroying military infrastructure to deny it to an advancing enemy is a recognized practice. What is less documented, and what appears in German Army Group South after action reports from October 1941, is the anti-disturbance wiring of specific buildings. German engineers attempting to clear and occupy several structures along the Khreshchatyk found that entry, doors, staircases, floorboards, and furniture had been connected to concealed explosive charges via tension wires and pressure fuses. At least 72 German soldiers were killed in booby trap incidents in Kiev in the weeks following the initial occupation. The Germans attributed the total death toll from the entire Kiev demolition operation buildings, mines, and booby traps combined at approximately 1,000 personnel. Soviet sources have never released a full accounting of what was placed and where. Some of those devices were never found. A partial building collapse in Kiev in 1981 exposed a section of foundation wiring that forensic engineers identified as NKVD demolition preparation from 1941. The charge had never detonated. 40 years underground, still functional. Number 10. The Japanese Type 99 anti-tank mine and its body trap conversion in the Pacific Theater. The Type 99 was Japan's primary anti-tank mine during the Pacific War. A flat, circular device containing approximately 5.5 pounds of TNT, designed for vehicle interdiction. Standard doctrine, documented and legal. The banned conversion was this: Japanese troops on Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Peleliu, and the Philippines modified the Type 99 by removing the standard pressure fuse and replacing it with a pull fuse attached to a concealed tripwire. The device was then placed beneath or beside a fallen Japanese soldier and covered partially. American Marines approaching to confirm casualties' standard battlefield procedure necessary for reporting and for preventing feigned death attacks would snag the tripwire. The charge containing 5.5 pounds of TNT at a distance of 0 to 3 feet is not a wounding device. U.S. Marine Corps after-action reports from Peleliu in September of 1944 describe the practice as widespread and systematic. The reports note that by the third week of the Peleliu campaign, Marine units had adopted a brutal but pragmatic response. They stopped approaching fallen Japanese soldiers without first firing additional rounds into the body from a distance. The fuse conversion on the Type 99 mine is not discussed in any Japanese military legal code from the period. It was never raised at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. The Marines who adapted their procedures to survive it came home, and mostly didn't talk about what that procedure required them to do. Number 11. The German Topf mine and the S mine with anti-personnel collar trap. The Topf mine pot mine was a large-diameter anti-tank mine produced from 1943 onward using a pressed earthenware ceramic body, specifically to defeat metal detection. But the device combination that appears in the most war crimes documentation is the Topf mine, placed with a secondary S-mine positioned alongside it, connected by a short wire, in what German engineers called a combination layout. An Allied sapper detecting and beginning to clear a Topf mine would disturb the S-mine. The Bouncing Betty fires upward, 360 fragments at chest height. The targeting logic was explicit in the German engineering manual for this layout. The secondary device was placed to engage the engineer who discovered and was attempting to neutralize the primary device. The manual's language, and this was recovered in a Wehrmacht engineering unit's materials at war's end, described the goal as rendering mine clearance operations unprofitable. That phrase, unprofitable. The Allied engineers who read that translation were not confused about what it meant. Now, you see, the combination layout itself was not unprecedented. Armies had been placing secondary devices near primary ones since World War I. What made the German system distinct was its documentation, its standardization, and its explicit instruction at the manual level to target the person conducting mine clearance. That is not a field modification made by a frightened soldier in a trench. That is institutional policy, printed, distributed, taught. Whether that distinction changed anything for the sapper who triggered it is a question that answers itself. Number 12. The Mousetrap and the OSS Aunt Jemima Flower Bomb, the Civilian Object Booby Trap Program. This final entry is the one that stayed classified the longest, and for reasons that should be obvious by the time we get to the specifics. In 1942 and 1943, the Office of Strategic Services, working with the British SOE and with input from the Chinese nationalist resistance, developed a program to produce explosive charges disguised as common civilian commodities. The most famous of these was a substance known internally as Aunt Jemima, a mixture of cyclonite, explosive, and flour that looked, handled, and even smelled like ordinary wheat flour. It could be kneaded, shaped, and stored indefinitely without special precautions. It would not detonate from fire or impact alone. It required a detonator. This meant it could be transported through enemy checkpoints, concealed in food supplies, mixed into bakery deliveries, or stored in kitchens without detection. OSS operatives in China used it extensively to destroy Japanese rail infrastructure. Standard use: shape the material around a bridge support or a rail junction. Insert a time pencil detonator. Walk away. The banned application, the one that appears in a single, partially declassified OSS memorandum from 1943, reference number redacted, currently held in the National Archives under a mandatory review classification, was the proposal to introduce Aunt Jemima into flour supplies destined for German-controlled bakeries in occupied France and Belgium without detonators, as a passive contamination. The theory: contaminated flour would eventually be combined with a detonator-equivalent heat source in an industrial baking oven, resulting in an explosion. The collateral casualty estimate in the memorandum was not zero. The program was not approved for that application. The memorandum recommending it was written by a named OSS officer. That officer received a commendation for separate operations the following year. The document exists. The name is on it. And as of the last mandatory declassification review, the name remains redacted. That is the architecture of this category of warfare. 12 devices, 2 sides, an entire legal framework that both sides signed, ratified, and carried into battle in the Geneva Protocols, printed, filed, and the engineers kept working. Some of these devices are still in the ground. Not metaphorically, literally. The Belgian Federal Explosives Disposal Service DOVO logged 3,466 items recovered in 1923 alone. That was World War I material. They are still finding World War II devices in German forests, Italian fields, and Pacific Island beaches every single year. The Glassman, with its glass and cardboard construction, does not degrade the way steel does. An intact Glassman buried in 1944 has the same functional explosive capacity today as the day it was placed. The men who designed some of these devices went back to civilian engineering after the war. Some of them taught, some of them consulted for governments. Some of their design principles, the anti-disturbance mechanism, the secondary device protocol, the sensor-defeating material substitution appear in modern landmine and IED designs documented in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. The line from those field manuals to the devices that are killing people today is not a metaphor. It is a procurement history, and most of it is still classified.